and welcome to the German Classic podcast of the 2022 German Classic Prize. This year we are reading Annette von Droste-Hülshoff's novella Die Judenbuche. I'm Natasha, a fourth-year DPhil student in medieval German at Jesus College at Oxford University, and I'm the coordinator of the German Classic Prize this year. In this podcast series, we provide insights into the text to help you to study it along with us. With me today are Lucy, Jana and George, who are studying German at Oxford. Thank you very much for being here with me today. Together we will discuss questions like, is Die Judenbuche a whodunit? How does its narrative style influence us readers? And why are there so many red herrings? But before we get into discussion, could you just tell me a bit about yourself, where you're from, how did you end up studying German at Oxford, and maybe what did you enjoy in particular?
Yeah, so I'm Lucy, I'm from Newcastle, and I studied German alongside English. I suppose I selected German post A-level because I wanted to study something alongside English literature. And hadn't really had much exposure to German literature at A-level and wanted to pursue it further at uni. And I'm really glad I did because there's so much opportunity to do comparative stuff between English and German, and you're definitely not restricted to just studying the German classics. There's lots of scope to do contemporary stuff as well here. So
brilliant, that sounds really great.
Yeah, thanks very much. So I'm George, and I've just come to the end of my degree in French and German.
Congrats.
Thank you. And I studied at Brasenose College, so I'm initially from just outside of Bristol, kind of Somerset area. And I think probably similar reasons to Lucy, I really enjoyed languages at A-level. I had really fantastic teachers, and very much enjoyed the kind of mixture of learning a language. Also, we studied film, we studied some literature at A-level, and I knew that you were able to get that diversity as well at Oxford, studying modern languages with the year abroad, of course, and it ended up being a really fantastic, very diverse degree, and you can really shape it depending on what you want to take away from it and what you're interested in.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, I would agree. I'm Janae, I'm from Chester, and I studied German and Italian, just finished as well. And same reasons as you guys. I really liked the fact that at Oxford you can kind of combine language and literature, and the course is really literature heavy because initially I wanted to do a degree in literature, but having the language alongside of that makes it even more exciting, and you study a lot more range of text than you would study just doing one language or just doing English literature. So yeah, I love literature, and getting to do it in another language is even better.
Oh, thanks so much for the insight, guys. And with this, I would say let's get into the discussion. So now, Die Judenbuche is often described as being one of the first whodunits. So my first question to you, therefore, would be: what aspects actually justify seeing Die Judenbuche as a whodunit?
I think the main case for viewing the text as a whodunit is that there are unsolved crimes going on in the text, and they remain unsolved. So it's a sort of a whodunit which remains open and unsolved. And I think it's interesting as well that the it is also not clear, because there are different crimes, murders, unsolved things going on, and because there are lots of those within the narrative, you could say it's comprised of several whodunits. Yeah.
No, absolutely, I really, really agree with that. And I think something which I remember as well from the first time that I read the text, which I found reading whodunits in English as well, is that they're always very fun. They're really, really fun to read. And obviously when we read, we're always kind of engaged with what we're reading, but I think it's the sort of text which really encourages this very active engagement, and you really need to think about what's going on. And I always think it's quite fun to try and almost guess what's going to come, maybe jump back a paragraph and reread what you've just read and actually try and think, okay, well, I've just learned something new, and how does that then change what I know? And it's really just this kind of constant process of piecing together clues, and I do think it lends itself to just being a very fun text to read and explore, and it's quite playful.
So, and then kind of building on that. So, if you had to decide between the two genre concepts, kind of the detective story or the crime story, which one would you kind of like go with if you had to decide for one or the other?
I'd be leaning towards saying it's more of a crime story because I think there's not actually a detective in the story to call it a detective novel, but also I guess the reader's kind of encouraged to be the detective, and instead of having this sort of reinforcement of order that you might get in a detective novel where you kind of come to a conclusion and you feel as if everything's been solved, it's kind of the opposite, and there's more focus on the actual crimes themselves as being kind of part of the community, and they're always like there, but it's not really a kind of direction of solving it and having a detective that comes to the end of that. It's more a sense of mystery, a sense of lots of crimes happening, and we're never quite getting to the bottom of them.
And I think, obviously, we don't necessarily know what Annetta's intentions were when she was writing, but I found as well that the initial title of the text when it was first published was actually Eine Kriminalgeschichte, Friedrich Mergel, and then followed up with Ein Sittengemälde aus dem gebürgten Westfalen. So they kept the second part of the title, but for whatever reason, the author or the editors did away with this kind of clear pigeonholing as Eine Kriminalgeschichte. So I think it's really, you read it as you want. If you want to play the detective, you can play the detective, but I think the crime kind of element at the heart is really important.
The title is such a good point. Like, could we actually say, because I've already said in the intro that we encounter quite a few red herrings, and could we actually say that Die Judenbuche is one of the first red herrings as just a title of the work? Is that the first red herring we encounter? What does it do to us readers?
I think because we anticipate that Die Judenbuche will end up being the central motif of the text, but actually in terms of the narrative structure, this motif is only introduced relatively late on, and sure, it's the sort of closing section of the story, but I think you'd be hard pushed to say that the full text revolves around just this tree. It doesn't at all, and it doesn't even revolve around the murder of Aaron. So yeah, I think that is the first red herring that we encounter when we anticipate that this motif is going to be really important to the text, when actually there are other parts which maybe we should be devoting more attention to.
Maybe coming back to the kind of criminal aspect we encounter, we've already kind of heard that there's not really a detective. There might be some very kind of unadept detectives which we encounter, but like, how is in general like criminal behavior dealt with maybe by the people in positions of power, such as the landowner?
I think it's quite brushed over and not really investigated properly. So there's a lot of instances where the crime happens and then it doesn't really get properly investigated, and then the narrative voice has to kind of intrude and tell us this is disappointing for the reader, but this is exactly what happened. So there's a sense that crime is not really properly investigated, and it's kind of also in the beginning we get told how the landowners sort of deal with it with their own sense of like personal judgment rather than it being like a sort of official court of law. So it seems like the like sense of justice is coming really from the local community and not coming from a sort of a sense of overarching order. So yeah, I think this kind of adds to the kind of instability that you feel as you read the book, because the crimes themselves aren't getting properly solved and dealt with, and that's kind of left again to the reader.
Maybe we could move on to like one of the main, besides the murders, one of the main crimes we see is the stealing of wood. But what kind of importance does that crime actually take on within the narrative, and how does it relate to the murders?
I mean, I suppose the foresting labour is the context for Friedrich. That's his profession, and that sets him in conflict with the sort of foreign tribe who move in and encroach upon this industry. And so I think there's definitely scope for mapping the murder, which is motivated by financial reasons and his grievances with Aaron, onto the socioeconomic struggle which is happening across the wider village. and which the foresters are most affected by because they rely on it for prosperity, and when this other tribe, the Blaukittel, move in, they see that as a real threat and respond quite violently to this new threat.
So are the Blaukittel then just responding to that threat, or what kind of role do they actually take on within the narrative? What's their function, possibly?
I think maybe to act as a contrast to the village and to maybe foreground how closed of a community the village of Bay is, and how they rally around absolutely in defence against the Blaukittel, and quite a lot of the way that the Blaukittel are represented is in terms of their immorality, and I think that, you know, their shame is foregrounded and they're described as an abomination, and so this sets the whole village and the community apart from the foreign influence, whoever they are. I think they remain very ambiguous and mysterious in the text, which is important.
I think you can quite clearly delineate as well that we have the forest, if we're speaking about kind of the geographies of the story almost. I think the Blaukittel is so closely associated with the forest, which takes on this kind of almost kind of lawless, quite mysterious setting, which is something which we see throughout. And at the start, there's kind of this notion that people are slinking off into the forest at night, and it's this almost kind of gothic setting where there's this immorality, this kind of criminality, and then come daybreak, people slink back into the village. And I think it really ends up painting the forest out to be this place where kind of morals go out the window. And I think in that sense, the presence of the Blaukittel also sets the story up quite nicely, because we almost expect these crimes to take place in the forest. And yeah.
Oh yeah, definitely. I was just going to say, I think I agree with Lucy that it's setting up a contrast, but at the same time I think it's also showing the similarities between the people in the village and the Blaukittel, because there's a sense of lack of justice and the fact that they're also uniform and they can't really pick one of them out to basically criminalise them and like hold them accountable for their behaviour. I think that represents this whole atmosphere in the village in general of being isolated and having their own sort of sense of justice where no one can really be identified because the system itself is at fail, and they have their own sort of reasonings and their own way of hiding, which is all to do with the forest and how they can hide there, and it's all sort of part of the same atmosphere, the same community.
With a sort of mob mentality almost, which ends up forming.
Brilliant. Maybe moving on to the kind of more brutal, more horrible crimes we encounter. Could we actually then say, based on that the Judenbuch is a novella just about killing?
I think there are other crimes going on as well, which are worth paying attention to. And I think we could say it's about violence, but the first instance of violence we encounter is the domestic violence, which Hermann subjects his wife to, which is important as well. And then there's the later instance of a similar kind of female violence where there's a bride who's forced to marry against her will. That's an important crime worth paying attention to. And then others like the usury, and often these sort of lower level crimes underpin the killing which comes later. So they should be taken into consideration as well.
So kind of maybe even lead up to the kind of the murder. Maybe looking at the murders, how does the murder of the Forest of Brandis and the killing of the Jewish merchant Aaron actually differ? What would you say, what was the difference there?
I think perhaps one of the main differences, which I think lends itself quite well to interpretation, is how the crimes are actually treated afterwards, how they're approached, what the community response is. And in the case of Brandis, we have this, as we've already discussed, it's perhaps not the most fulfilling investigation, which is kind of fraught with these difficulties and almost this need for closure and a need to find someone guilty regardless of how the investigation actually runs. But there is nevertheless this process of speaking to people and of really trying to piece together what happened. And I think the flip side is then with the murder of Aaron, there's less attention paid to it, and there is a rallying of a community, but it's a very specifically Jewish community, which I think is perhaps interesting if we think about the kind of prejudices which the story also explores, if we're talking about other instances of violence, this kind of this religious prejudice almost. So.
Moving on from these kind of more dramatic aspects, I would really like to discuss the narrative style or role and the role we as readers take on while reading the novella. Maybe could you just tell me a bit more about how the narration works in the novella? How are we as readers guided through the events of the story?
I think that there's certain instances where the narrator talks about themselves in the first person, and they're the interesting parts because we get an insight into what they see their role as, and it's not as this objective reportage narrator. It's actually a narrator who's interested in providing a good story or an exciting story, which complicates our ability to see the novella as just about the reporting of crime, because they give very little information about the specific questions being asked at the inquiries or the investigations, and they talk about how they don't want to disappoint the reader with the information they're able to give or not give, which suggests that this narrator doesn't see themselves as a detective. They have a creative role to fulfill.
And I think there's also this idea that if people have read maybe any realist works, quite often you're kind of afforded these really, really detailed passages and a narrative which is, although different events will kind of have more narrative time afforded to them, there's generally quite a kind of linear progression, and you'll have 1 week and then we'll move to the next. Whereas here in the Judenbuch we have these kind of enormous jumps in time as well. The narrator's kind of giving us these fragments. Suddenly Friedrich is 9 years old, and then we jump to, you have these kind of markers where it will say, it was July 1756 at 3 a.m. and there's kind of seemingly no order to it, but it really adds to that sense of having to piece together everything. And to just go back to that point about it being kind of quite a playful text, I think you do have to really put kind of some thought into working out how it all fits together.
Yeah, I think it's interesting actually, building on that. Like typically with the sort of realist novella, they place a lot of emphasis on the event, whereas this narrator seems to do the sort of opposite and take away from the event, and the event's kind of hidden behind the scenes. So we don't really see any of the murders happening. It's more you're left to figure it out yourself, and you get a lot of instances where the murder is only reported in speech. Where is this person, and they've gone missing already. You don't actually see the actual act happening. So it's quite an interesting reversal to the sort of typical traits of the novella, which places emphasis on these sort of exceptional events because they're still happening, but they're kind of lurking behind the scenes.
It's very good. I think that leads actually into my next question quite nicely, because I think what we also see is ambiguity being created. And how do we actually experience that as readers? And maybe that also kind of answers the question, why is the narrative so important in this kind of creating of ambiguity? How are we influenced by her?
I think it connects quite nicely thematically to the fact that these investigations happen, and it's always emphasised that there's a really high probability that they know who's committed XYZ murder, but they don't have the evidence to say it with definitive certainty. And that's similar to the position that we're put in as a reader, because the narrator's telling us a story which is probable, it's plausible, but there's always the possibility that there's an ulterior explanation going on. So like with the death of Hermann at the beginning of the novella is explained as an accident, that he's died because of hypothermia. But there's also the possibility that this was actually a murder, or that there are unexplained strange circumstances behind it. The fact that he reappears as a ghost later on in the text is an ambiguous, inexplicable event, which the narrator doesn't help clarify, if anything complicates, because we're provided with an explanation which doesn't really tie up to what happens later.
No, it leaves quite a lot open. maybe we could talk a little bit about the comments we receive from the narrator throughout the story. For example, the kind of blood stain we are being made aware during the trial. Yeah, could you literally comment on the comments we receive?
I think in that moment, the narrator sort of says the investigation didn't go anywhere. Sorry, I'd have to find the page exactly for the quote, but how the investigation didn't go anywhere, and it's kind of an apologetic narrator being like, you know, I wish that it kind of did lead somewhere, but it didn't, and this is just the truth that I have to say it as it is. So it's kind of similar to what Lucy was saying earlier about how the narrator feels sort of duty to storytelling, but at the same time, the contrasted duty of actually telling the truth, and this was an unresolved murder case that did actually happen. So yeah, I guess the narrator making their role as a narrator very well known to the reader, and I guess that adds to the sense of like ambiguity and the sort of instability you feel as a reader, because you kind of, there are moments when you get sucked into it, and then there are moments where the narrative voice comes in and reminds you you're reading a story that's simultaneously trying to tell you the truth but also trying to entertain you. So yeah, I think it reminds you that you're actually reading fiction and kind of truth at the same time.
And I think it's that as well which almost invites us quite nicely into the story, the fact that we have this narrator who is at points perhaps omniscient, but also seems very human in that there's kind of limits to her, if we're talking about the author, or to the narrator's knowledge. And I think it almost encourages you to kind of put yourself on the same plane. It's not that you're being told a story, it's you're being almost invited into the narrative to kind of work through these events alongside them.
And how is it for the reader? Are we sometimes also being misled, and what kind of red herrings do we actually encounter while reading it?
I think there's one moment where towards the end of the novella, after the kind of investigations about Aaron are sort of closed, a note arrives from like the from another court or something saying, oh, actually it might not have been Friedrich that did this all along. There's another suspect. I'm pretty sure it says it could have easily been anyone. So it's interesting how just at the point where you feel kind of confident after Friedrich has escaped, and you think, oh, it must have been him, why would he have run away? Then you get this other sort of clue that could potentially lead it another way, but also, I don't know, it's never certain, and then it also doesn't lead anywhere. So the sense of we're constantly less uncertain as to whether it was actually Friedrich who killed Aaron, or whether it was somebody else, and the fact that they say it could be anyone, kind of, it seems to be the sort of message of the novel, that it could be anyone in this sort of lawlessness, this village where anything sort of goes.
I don't know if we'd call it a red herring necessarily, but I think if we look at kind of how the text is structured as a whole, something we maybe haven't touched on are these kind of Gothic elements which are kind of present throughout the text. And I think that maybe you can see that as being this kind of overarching red herring, in that there are kind of twists and turns, and you're never quite sure about whether the events that are happening are these kind of slightly supernatural, maybe inexplicable occurrences, or if it is just the case that we're dealing with these kind of quite morally corrupt people. I think that's something you see quite a lot in these kind of semi-Gothic narratives, and maybe even something we still see if you think about kind of magical realism. There are these elements where you're never quite sure where reality lies, and I think that's something which kind of constantly leaves you questioning. And just when you think, okay, this did really happen, actually there's this kind of almost phantom-like figure which appears, and there are people who clearly believe in these mythical elements. I think that's something which, again, like you were saying, kind of slightly detracts from any certainty about what's going on.
Yeah, maybe kind of going back from those very fascinating kind of Gothic elements, which I really enjoyed, maybe going back to thinking about the kind of traditional detective or crime stories. Why might readers who enjoy those traditional detective or crime stories, why might they be disappointed in the Judenbuche?
Because there is no resolution. There is no criminal who is detected with any certainty. Yeah. So there's no sense of satisfaction or closure. And if anything, the text deliberately remains really open-ended. Yeah. And so if that's the kind of narrative or plot development that you're looking for, like crime, investigation, resolution, that's not what the Judenbuche provides.
Sorry.
No, I was only going to agree with Lucy. Yeah, absolutely. And there's almost this kind of frustration at the end, just because there is so much uncertainty. And when we were kind of thinking about the question beforehand and thinking about whodunits, I was thinking about when you read books, I don't know, kind of like Gone Girl, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's neatly packaged at the end, and everything suddenly makes sense, and we just don't have that.
And also like what Janae was saying earlier about how the murders themselves happen behind the scenes. If you're reading a whodunit for the really gruesome or gory details, again, you're going to be disappointed with this book because that is deliberately withheld and we're sort of presented with a crime after the event.
So what does the reader actually gain from not having the book follow this kind of traditional whodunit structure? What are we actually kind of gaining? What else does the Jugendbuch offer to us as readers?
I think it gives a much more detailed portrayal of the actual society and the circumstances, especially in the opening. It really goes into detail about the lawlessness, the foresters, the sort of the backdrop of what Friedrich has grown up in. And in that sense, I guess it wouldn't make sense for it to have this sort of neat conclusion of there being a murderer who's responsible that everyone kind of puts shame on and they get condemned, because you really get an insight into why these people act in a certain way and why Friedrich has been brought up that way. And if it was him to commit these murders, then because he's been told his entire life that this is the sort of way people act in the forest.
And maybe one of my last questions. Do you think we are justified in considering the Jugendbuch as a proper German classic?
I think so. I think, it's because it doesn't follow this more simple whodunit structure. There's loads of room for representation of the other people in the fictitious society who are also, they have their parallels in real German society of the time. So women, Jews, poor people, labourers, and that, in that sense, the novella's an effective exploration of Germany at this time, and specifically a portrayal of the people who were most oppressed and the people who had to deal with the most suffering at this time. And it's done in a really clever and original way. And it is a good read. It's like you say, it's fun to read and it's fun to make your own mystery of the text. So in that sense, I think it qualifies as a classic.
Yeah, like you were saying, it's definitely, I'm sure other texts before had kind of experimented with narrative perspective in a similar way, but I think the fact that you have this kind of sustained, we've spoken about this fragmented narrative and these twists and turns, the fact that that's sustained coupled with the kind of thematic concerns, and I think also for the time at least, considering this kind of depiction of rural Germany not necessarily as this lovely kind of like pastoral setting where there's this, there's this kind of romantic idea of nature and these beautiful forests and mountains and things like that. Actually, you also get this kind of very well-rounded psychological portrait of society, which I think at points is quite kind of harrowing in terms of the darker side of people. So as Janae was saying, you really get kind of an insight into the fact that there is no one baddie. It's kind of a combination of everyone's kind of slightly corrupt morals that lead to the quite tragic events of it.
And actually that leads very nicely in I think my last question, kind of building on those corrupt morals. Could we say that the Jugendbuch is still relevant today?
Yeah, I think so. I think obviously the issues that we deal with today might not be exactly the same as presented here, but I definitely think ideas about the justice system are still relevant today, about crimes not being investigated properly, especially amongst minority communities.
I think at points you maybe have to read it carefully, but also I think you can read it as a warning against the sorts of prejudices which the people in the story exhibit. And if we think about the start, Friedrich's mother kind of in the same breath almost denounces these people who are drinking and kind of on the fringes of society, but at the same time comes out with these kind of very anti-Semitic beliefs. And I think it does quite a good job at exposing, even if I think there's some debate around that, I think it does quite a good job at exposing this kind of two-sided nature that people can display, and people have prejudices, but I think it can be read as a warning against that.
That's brilliant.
And it's like what you were saying about how this commentary on the justice system and where the law and religion feed into the justice system, they're definitely still relevant themes and concerns today. And we see that in literature, you know, the likes of Kafka and like super contemporary literature, they're still concerned with the exact same questions that the Judenbuche is concerned with way back then. So, yeah, I think there's a nice parallel to draw between this book and more modern texts.
Brilliant. Thank you. Maybe one last question. If you had to think of one kind of thing you're taking away from the text for our kind of viewers, what would that be? What are you taking away from the text for yourself?
I think I would say, as a sort of recommendation before reading the book, let go of any expectations. But not in a bad way that it's going to disappoint them, but in the sense of just take it as it is and kind of let yourself get carried away in the text, but don't expect it to be any type of genre, any detective fiction like we discussed. Yeah, I think just like really like enjoy it, and kind of it encourages you as a reader to let go of your expectations and just accept what is on the page in front of you, even if it's frustrating sometimes. Yeah.
That's really good.
I think I'd probably say don't take sides. There's something where you go into kind of, I don't know, any sort of kind of crime thriller, horror type book. I think quite often you are kind of rooting for one side or another, and I think part of the novella always traps you, I think, at points, in that it kind of encourages you to side with one particular viewpoint. And I think don't let yourself be kind of rooted in that. Let the narrative kind of pick you up and throw you around and take you to different places, and really just keep an open mind again. And yeah, I think get stuck in and enjoy it.
It's always hardest to be the last one.
I think I would say consider whose perspective we aren't getting in every instance, because yes, the murders are probably the most concentrated on aspect of the text, but like we were saying before about the bride who's married off against her will and the depictions of domestic violence at the beginning, they're also important, but singly because the narrator doesn't pay much attention to them doesn't mean that we as the reader shouldn't probe these instances a little bit further, because I think that's the point at which the underrepresented in society are sort of paralleled as the underrepresented in the text as well. So these are the women and the Jewish characters, and with that approach I think you can make the text a lot richer than we might appreciate it as at face value.
That was really great. Thank you so much for all of those great thoughts and inspiring ideas. Yeah, with this, we are actually at the end of our podcast. So thank you all again very much for joining me today in this discussion. And to our viewers, of course, thank you very much for listening. And we hope to welcome you back to, for our next podcast episode. In the meantime, click on the subscribe button and the bell icon to follow us on YouTube, and so that you're notified as soon as we upload a new video. And you can also follow us on Twitter at OxfordGermanNet for more resources and German content. And lastly, for more information on the German Classic Prize, just visit our website, which is shown below. Thank you very much for joining us.